Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today we will hear the story of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. The year is 1775, a time of hardship and unrest. England and France are both struggling. In France, the government spends too much while ordinary people live in poverty. Even small protests are met with harsh punishments. In England, highway robberies are common, and even hangings fail to curb the crime. The nobles and aristocrats live in comfort, ignoring the struggles of their people and the growing signs of rebellion. On a cold night in late November, the mail coach from London slowly makes its way toward Dover. Inside, three passengers, strangers to one another, sit in silence. As the coach climbs a hill, a rider on horseback approaches. He is Jerry Cruncher, a messenger from Tellson's Bank in London. Jerry delivers a message to one of the passengers, Mr. Jarvis Lorry, a clerk at Tellson's. The message reads, "Wait at Dover for Mademoiselle." Mr. Lorry gives an unusual reply, instructing Jerry to return to London with the words, "Recalled to life." Jerry does not understand the message but follows the instructions without question. The mail coach continues its journey toward Dover. Mr. Lorry dozes off, drifting in and out of sleep. In his dream, he sees a man who has been buried for 18 years and has dug his way out. Mr. Lorry imagines asking the man over and over if he cares to live. The man can never answer for sure. The next morning, Mr. Lorry arrives at the Royal George Hotel in Dover. In the afternoon, he meets Lucy Manette, a short, slight, and pretty young woman who has come to hear some news about her long-dead father. Mr. Lorry tells Lucy that her father, Dr. Alexander Manette, is alive. He has been found in Paris after being imprisoned for 18 years. Tellson's Bank has sent him to identify Dr. Manette and bring him to England. He asks Lucy to help care for her father and restore him to health. Lucy is shocked by the news. Her servant, Miss Pross, quickly rushes to her side and calls for smelling salts to revive her. The setting shifts from Dover to Saint Antoine, a poor suburb of Paris. A cask of wine falls to the street, spilling its contents. The people rush to scoop up the wine. Men kneel to drink from their hands, while women soak up the liquid with their handkerchiefs and squeeze it into their babies' mouths. One man dips his finger into the muddy wine sediments and writes the word "blood" on a wall. The wine shop is owned by Marquis de Evrémonde, a strong-looking man of about 30. His wife, Madame Defarge, sits silently behind the counter. Defarge is expecting Mr. Lorry and Lucy, but pretends not to recognize them. Instead, he speaks with other customers who refer to each other as Jacques, a code name for revolutionaries. After sending them to another chamber, Defarge leads Lorry and Lucy up the stairs. He opens the door to a room and reveals a white-haired man, Dr. Alexander Manette. Dr. Manette works steadily at his bench, making shoes. When asked his name, he responds with his prison cell number 105 North Tower. He believes he is still imprisoned. Mr. Lorry asks him if he recognizes anyone. It seems as if he does for a moment, but his face quickly clouds over. When Lucy approaches him, however, she seems familiar to him, especially after he compares her hair to two golden hairs that he kept tied in a cloth around his neck. At first he mistakes her for his wife, remembering that on the first day of his imprisonment he begged to keep these few hairs as a spiritual escape from his circumstances. Slowly, he begins to recognize her. Lucy embraces her father, comforting him as he begins to weep. She tells him that the home he has longed for is waiting. They must leave Paris for England immediately. With the help of Defarge, Mr. Lorry and Lucy arrange for a coach. As they make way to the ship, Mr. Lorry wonders if Dr. Manette can truly be brought back to life or if something has been lost forever. 5 years have passed, and now it is 1780. Tellson's Bank in London is located near Temple Bar, the spot where until recently the government displayed the heads of executed criminals. Death is frequently used as punishment for criminals. Jerry Cruncher works as a porter and messenger for Tellson's. He lives in a small apartment in a rough part of London with his wife and son. Jerry is sent to the Old Bailey courthouse to deliver a message to Mr. Lorry. Upon arrival, he enters the crowded courtroom where the trial of Charles Darnay, a handsome and well-bred young man, is underway. Darnay stands accused of treason, specifically of passing secret information to the King of France about England's plans to send armed forces to the American colonies. Charles Darnay pleads not guilty, as the punishment for treason is death by being drawn and quartered. The condemned person is dragged to the execution site and hanged by the neck, but not to the point of death, so they can endure further punishment. Then the person would be disemboweled, with their intestines and other internal organs removed. The person would then be beheaded, and the body would be cut into 4 quarters, with the limbs displayed in public. Darnay's fate seems uncertain, as he is defended by the indifferent Mr. Carton. The Attorney General accuses Charles Darnay of treason. The first witness, John Barsad, testifies against Darnay, but during cross-examination, Mr. Stryver reveals that Barsad has a shady past. Another witness, Roger Cly, also accuses Darnay, but Stryver questions his credibility too. Mr. Lorry, Lucy, and Dr. Manette are called to testify. Mr. Lorry remembers meeting Darnay on a coach 5 years ago, though he couldn't identify him properly. Lucy talks about meeting Darnay on a ship and how he helped care for her father. But Lucy unintentionally harms his case by mentioning Darnay's travel with other Frenchmen and how he commented highly of George Washington. But the trial takes a turn when Sydney Carton, a colleague of Stryver, points out that he looks very much like Darnay. This revelation casts doubt on the prosecution's case, especially when a witness admits he cannot be sure if it is Darnay or Carton he saw. This makes it hard for the witness to be sure of his identification. After the jury deliberates, Darnay is acquitted. Jerry Cruncher is sent to deliver the verdict to Tellson's Bank. After the trial, Darnay thanks Stryver for his help and kisses Lucy's hand. Mr. Lorry scolds Sydney Carton for his lack of seriousness, and Carton and Darnay head to a nearby tavern for dinner. During their meal, Carton reveals that Darnay faced trial partly to receive Lucy's sympathy. It is also revealed that Carton feels unloved and uncared for. After Darnay leaves, Carton reflects on his wasted potential, realizing that if he had lived differently, he might have been worthy of Lucy's love. Later, Sydney Carton drinks with Mr. Stryver. Stryver praises Carton for his clever contribution regarding Darnay's identification, but points out that Carton's mood swings have been evident since their school days. Carton admits that he lacks the ambition to match Stryver's success. Stryver changes the topic to Lucy, sensing that Carton's feelings for her may be more complicated than he admits. Afterward, Carton returns to his apartment where he briefly imagines a different life full of hope and love. He falls asleep, crying into his pillow, overwhelmed by the emptiness of his life. 4 months after the trial, Mr. Lorry visits Dr. Manette and Lucy. When Dr. Manette and Lucy are out, Mr. Lorry speaks with Miss Pross, Lucy's governess. They discuss the numerous suitors who come to see Lucy. Miss Pross dismisses them all as unworthy and believes only her brother Solomon is fit for Lucy. However, Mr. Lorry knows that Solomon is a scoundrel who left Miss Prossy in poverty. Lucy and her father return, and Charles Darnay joins them. Later, Sydney Carton arrives and joins the group as a storm approaches. Lucy imagines that the echoes of footsteps from the street belong to people who will come into their lives in the future. Monseigneur is a powerful lord of France who holds receptions every 2 weeks in Paris. He surrounds himself with the greatest luxury and state officials who know nothing of state business but everything about fashion. A storm approaches as the party breaks up. One guest, the Marquis de Evrémonde, departs for his estate. His carriage drives wildly through the streets, causing peasants to dive frantically out of the way. The carriage hits and kills a small child. The child's father, Gaspard, grieves, and the Marquis tosses him a gold coin as compensation. Defarge, the wine shop owner, steps forward to comfort Gaspard. The Marquis gives Defarge another gold coin for making the philosophical observation that the child is better off dead. As the Marquis is driving away, Defarge throws the coin back at the carriage. When the Marquis arrives at his chateau, a large mansion, he asks if Monsieur Charles has arrived from England yet. He is told that Monsieur Charles has not yet arrived. Monsieur Charles, whose arrival Marquis Evrémonde awaits, is actually his nephew Charles Darnay. Darnay arrives at night and tells his uncle that he wants to renounce the title and property he is set to inherit when the Marquis dies. He condemns the Evrémondes for their cruelty and oppression of the poor and declares that he will leave France to live in England. The Marquis dismisses his nephew's decision and mocks his new philosophy, telling Darnay to accept his natural destiny. The next morning, the Marquis is found dead, stabbed in the chest with a note signed Jacques. A year has passed since the Marquis's death. Charles Darnay has settled in England as a French teacher. He visits Dr. Manette to confess his love for Lucy and ask for his blessing. Darnay assures Dr. Manette that his intentions are honorable and he promises that his love for Lucy will not interfere with the bond she shares with her father. Dr. Manette, although initially uneasy, agrees to this. However, when Darnay attempts to reveal his real name and French ancestry, Dr. Manette stops him, asking him to wait until the morning of the wedding. Late that night, Stryver and Carton work together in Stryver's chambers. Stryver casually announces his intention to marry Lucy Manette, believing that she will make an ideal wife and that their marriage will benefit him both personally and professionally. Carton listens in silence, drinking heavily. Stryver then suggests that Carton should find a respectable woman with some property to marry, so that Carton won't end up penniless. He scolds Carton for his lack of appeal to women. Carton remains quiet and distant. His discomfort remains unnoticed by Stryver. The next day, Stryver plans to propose to Lucy. He stops by Tellson's bank to inform Mr. Lorry of his intentions. Mr. Lorry urges Stryver to hold off on his proposal until he has time to consult with the Manettes, offering to feel out the situation first. Later, after his consultation, Mr. Lorry informs Stryver that Lucy is unlikely to accept his proposal. Stryver declares that he is better off without her and decides to forget the proposal entirely. Sydney Carton visits Lucy one afternoon. During their conversation, Carton opens up about his wasted life and expresses deep despair, believing that he can never change or live a better life. Lucy is moved by his words. She assures him that he still has the potential to become a better man. Carton confesses his love for her, acknowledging that she is too good for him and that he would give his life for her and anyone dear to her. He asks her to keep his confession a secret. Lucy, pitying him, agrees. One morning outside Tellson's bank, Jerry Cruncher notices a funeral procession approaching. He learns that the crowd is preparing to bury Roger Clive, a convicted spy who had testified against Charles Darnay. Jerry joins the group and accompanies Clive's body to the burial site. That night, Cruncher leaves home. His son, young Jerry, suspicious of his father's activities, decides to follow him. Cruncher heads to a graveyard with two men, where they begin to dig up Clive's body. Young Jerry is terrified by the sight of the men digging. He runs home. The next morning, he asks his father what a resurrection man is. Cruncher explains that it is someone who sells bodies to saints, and young Jerry expresses his wish to become a resurrection man when he grows up. We now shift to France, where Ernest Defarge's wine shop in Saint Antoine is busy, even though most people can't afford to drink. Madame Defarge quietly knits while the others talk. Monsieur Defarge enters with a road mender whom he calls Jacques and offers him some wine. After a while, three men leave the shop and the road mender follows Defarge to the attic where Dr. Manette had been hidden. The three men, also called Jacques, are waiting outside. The road mender tells Defarge that the father of the child, who was run over by the Marquis, killed the Marquis in revenge. Months later, the man was caught and sentenced to death. His body was left hanging in the village. After hearing this, the Jacques decide to add the Marquis and his family to their list of people they want to punish. Madame Defarge has been knitting this list in a secret code that only she can understand. A policeman warns the Defarges about a new spy in the area named John Bursard. Madame Defarge decides to add his name to her list of people to target for the revolution. The next day, Bursard visits the wine shop. He pretends to sympathize with the poor and mentions that Lucy Manette is going to marry Charles Darnay, the nephew of the late Marquis. The news disturbs Defarge, and Madame Defarge adds Darnay's name to her list. The night before Lucy's wedding to Charles Darnay, she spends some quiet time with her father, Dr. Manette. Lucy shares how happy she is and reassures her father that her marriage won't change their relationship. Dr. Manette, thinking about his time in prison, tells Lucy that he often wondered what kind of person his child would be. He says he could never have imagined how happy Lucy would make him. He assures her that her marriage will only make their lives better, not cause any problems between them. On the day of Lucy and Darnay's wedding, Dr. Manette and Darnay have a private conversation, which makes Manette look very pale. After the wedding, Lucy and Darnay leave for their honeymoon. As soon as Lucy leaves, Manette starts acting strangely again, spending his time making shoes. Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross notice the change but decide not to tell Lucy, hoping that Manette will get better. They keep an eye on him for 9 days, but his condition doesn't improve. Mr. Lorry takes some time off from work to stay with him, but even after a week, Dr. Manette is still in the same state. They worry about how Lucy will react when she returns. On the 10th day, Dr. Manette wakes up as if nothing unusual has happened. Mr. Lorry asks him what might have caused the relapse. Dr. Manette explains that a strong memory or trauma must have triggered it. Mr. Lorry suggests that the shoemaking tools, which might have reminded him of the past, should be removed. When Lucy and Darnay return from their honeymoon, their first visitor is Sydney Carton. Carton feels worthless but asks if he can occasionally visit the family. Darnay gladly agrees. Later at dinner, Darnay comments on Carton's careless behavior. Lucy urges him to be kinder to Carton, explaining that, in spite of his faults, Carton has a good heart. She believes that Carton is capable of great things, even though he lacks confidence. Darnay promises to be more understanding and show sympathy for Carton in the future. 8 years have passed, and the year is 1789. Lucy and her family lead a peaceful life. She has a daughter, little Lucy, and a son who died young. Lucy continues to sit by the window, listening to the echoes of footsteps from the street below. These echoes now carry a ominous tone, suggesting the unrest brewing in France. One day, Mr. Lorry informs Darnay that many French aristocrats, in panic, are sending their property and money to England. In France, the revolution is gaining momentum. Led by the Defarges, a violent mob storms the Bastille. Defarge demands to be taken to the North Tower, where Dr. Manette had been imprisoned. In the cell, they find the initials A.M. carved into the wall. The mob frees prisoners, kills the guards, and heads to the governor's residence, where Madame Defarge beheads the governor. As France descends into chaos, the Darnays' peaceful life is threatened by the growing violence in their homeland. 1 week after the fall of the Bastille, a revolutionary mob led by Madame Defarge and a woman known as the Vengeance learns that Foulon, a wealthy man infamous for telling starving peasants to eat grass, has been captured. Foulon had faked his death to escape the mob but was later found hiding in the countryside. The mob drags him to the town hall where they hang him 3 times, with the rope breaking twice before he finally dies. They stuff his mouth with grass and put his head on a pike. The mob then captures Foulon's son-in-law, kills him, and mounts his head and heart on pikes. Madame Defarge, with the Vengeance, leads the revolutionaries, whose anger grows as they exact their vengeance on those who once oppressed them. One day, in the French countryside, the road mender meets a stranger who asks for directions to the Evrémonde chateau. Both are part of the revolutionary movement, and they carefully plan their actions. Later that night, the chateau is set on fire. The mob forces the local tax collector, Gabelle, to hide on the roof of his house. The burning of the chateau marks a turning point in the revolution as the people rise up against the aristocracy, taking violent action against the symbols of their oppression. The countryside is filled with unrest and the revolution's flames continue to spread. 3 years have passed since the fall of the Bastille. The French aristocracy has mostly fled to England, with many finding refuge in London. Tellson's Bank has become a hub for French emigrants, and Mr. Lorry has been assigned to visit the Paris branch to protect important bank documents. Troubled by the situation in France, Darnay tries to convince Mr. Lorry not to go. However, Lorry insists on traveling, accompanied by Jerry Cruncher for protection. Shortly afterward, a letter addressed to the Marquis de Evrémonde arrives at the bank. The letter, sent by Gabelle, a former servant of the Marquis, pleads for help. Gabelle has been imprisoned by the revolutionaries who have wrongly accused him of aiding the aristocracy. Believing that his renunciation of his title will protect him, Darnay decides to go to Paris. Determined to save Gabelle, he secretly leaves in the middle of the night, writing farewell letters to Lucy and Dr. Manette. When Darnay reaches Paris, he is immediately detained and sent to prison. At the prison, Darnay reminds his captors of his rights, but they inform him that as an emigrant he has no rights. He is confined to a small solitary cell. Haunted by thoughts of his wife Lucy and the life he left behind, his mind is filled with the image of Dr. Manette, who had once been imprisoned in a similar way. Defarge, now working for the revolution, refuses to help him. When Lucy and Dr. Manette learn of Darnay's imprisonment, they rush to Tellson's bank in Paris. Dr. Manette, with his reputation as a former Bastille prisoner, believes he can use his influence to save his son-in-law. As they look out the window, they see a mob sharpening weapons on a grindstone, preparing to kill the prisoners. The doctor rushes into the crowd, announcing his identity. The revolutionaries, respecting his past as a prisoner, carry him to the prison. Dr. Manette joins the mob to try and save Darnay. Mr. Lorry, worried about the safety of Tellson's bank, arranges for Lucy, her daughter, and Miss Pross to stay in a nearby apartment with Jerry Cruncher as their guard. He then receives a message from Monsieur Defarge informing him that Darnay is safe. Defarge, along with Madame Defarge and the Vengeance, visits Lucy to reassure her of future protection. Lucy begs Madame Defarge to show mercy to Darnay. However, Madame Defarge remains cold and says that the suffering of women like Lucy has been ignored for too long. After 4 days, Dr. Manette returns and explains that he was able to persuade the tribunal to keep Darnay alive. Although Darnay is not released, he is kept alive. Manette also shares that he has secured a position as the inspecting physician for 3 prisons, including La Force, where Darnay is held. This new role allows him to visit Darnay regularly and ensure his safety. The revolution gains momentum, and the King and Queen of France are beheaded. The revolutionaries continue to execute people at a rapid pace, and Darnay remains in prison for over a year. For over a year, Lucy waits outside the prison every day, hoping that her husband Darnay might see her through a window. One day, a wild crowd dances down the street singing a revolutionary song. Darnay's trial is scheduled for the next day, and Manette is confident that Darnay will fare well in it. At the trial of Charles Darnay, a rowdy crowd gathers, eager for his conviction. The trial takes a dramatic turn when Dr. Manette, Darnay's father-in-law, testifies in his favor. Darnay defends himself passionately, explaining that he renounced his aristocratic title and returned to France to save his former servant Gabelle. Gabelle and Dr. Manette further support his claim. Despite the crowd's initial anger, the jury acquits Darnay. The mob, once calling for his death, now cheers and celebrates his release, carrying him home in a chair. Lucy is overwhelmed with joy upon seeing her husband freed, and together they thank God and Dr. Manette. The next day, 4 soldiers knock on the door and re-arrest Darnay. Manette protests, but the soldiers explain that the Republic demands sacrifices. They reveal that Darnay is being accused by 3 people, Monsieur and Madame Defarge, and 1 unnamed individual. When Manette presses for the identity of the 3rd accuser, the soldiers say it will be revealed the next day during the trial. The officers leave with Darnay, leaving Lucy anxious about her husband's fate. Miss Pross and Jerry Cruncher are out running errands, when they stop at a wine shop in Saint Antoine. While there, Miss Pross sees her brother Solomon disguised as a French Republican. Just then, Sydney Carton appears and identifies Solomon as John Bursard, the English spy who had testified against Darnay during his trial in England. Carton reveals that Bursard has been serving as a spy for the French government and threatens to expose him unless he helps Darnay. Bursard agrees to assist Carton with his plan to save Darnay. The next day, the trial of Charles Darnay takes place. The courtroom is filled with a rowdy, bloodthirsty crowd. Darnay is accused by three individuals, Mukherjee and Madame Defarge, and surprisingly, Dr. Manette. Although Dr. Manette protests, Defarge reveals that he found a letter in Manette's old cell in the Bastille that accuses Darnay. As the trial continues, the jury seems poised to convict him. Meanwhile, Lucy is comforted by Carton, who offers a plan to save Darnay if necessary. With Bursard's help, Carton plans to smuggle Darnay out of prison if he is convicted. Carton decides to make a meaningful sacrifice for the people he cares about. He buys a packet of drugs and prepares for the worst. Dr. Manette's letter recounts a traumatic event from 1757 when he was forced by the Evrémondes to care for a young peasant woman and her brother. The woman, who had been violently abused by the brothers, died shortly after. The boy, fatally stabbed by one of the brothers, revealed the horrors his family had suffered and cursed the Evrémondes before he died. Despite the Evrémondes offering Dr. Manette gold to remain silent, he refused. The next day, Dr. Manette was arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille. He later denounced the Evrémondes in the letter, and the jury found Charles Darnay guilty, sentencing him to death for the crimes of his family. The courtroom erupted in fury, and the bloodthirsty crowd called for his execution. As Darnay is escorted back to his cell, John Bursard allows Lucy to say a final goodbye to her husband. Darnay tells Dr. Manette not to blame himself for the trial's outcome. Afterward, Carton accompanies the grieving Lucy to her apartment, advising Manette to make one last attempt to influence the prosecutors. However, both Carton and Mr. Lorry feel certain that there is no hope for Darnay. Sydney Carton visits Defarge's wine shop and overhears Madame Defarge plotting to accuse Lucy, Dr. Manette, and their daughter of supporting Darnay. Madame Defarge reveals that she is the surviving sister of the peasant family wronged by the Evrémondes and is determined to wipe out their entire family. Carton quickly returns to Tellson's and asks Mr. Lorry to prepare a carriage for Lucy and her family to leave Paris the following day. The next day, 52 people, including Darnay, are sentenced to death. Carton convinces Darnay to switch clothes with him and drugs him, making him unconscious. Bursard, thinking it is Darnay, carries him out to a waiting carriage. Guards believe that they are escorting Darnay. They take Carton to the execution line. Along the way, a young woman, wrongly sentenced to death, asks Carton if he is dying for Darnay. Carton replies that he is dying for Darnay, his wife and child. As Carton faces the guillotine in Darnay's place, Lucy and her family escape, believing they will one day be reunited in heaven. Madame Defarge plans to accuse Lucy, Dr. Manette, and their daughter of treason for mourning Darnay's death. Armed and determined, she heads to Lucy's apartment to catch her grieving. When she arrives, Miss Pross stops her. A fight breaks out and Madame Defarge pulls out a gun. During the struggle, the gun accidentally goes off, killing Madame Defarge. With her death, the Manettes and their supporters are no longer in danger, and Miss Pross, along with Jerry Cruncher, safely leaves Paris. The next day, Carton, disguised as Darnay, is taken to the guillotine. As he faces death, he imagines a time when the revolutionaries who sentenced him, like Barsad and Madame Defarge, will also face their end. He also imagines a peaceful future for Lucy, Darnay, and their family, with a son named after him. Carton dies feeling proud of his sacrifice, thinking, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." Dickens leaves us with a lot of sadness, but also with a glimmer of hope as he ends his novel, A Tale of Two Cities. Tell us what you feel about the story, and also tell us about any other story which you want me to tell you. Subscribe to our channel for more videos and podcasts like this. So till we meet again, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Good night.